start with considering layout. Layout is a matter of how you arrange text on a page and how you number the text. Few people are as excited about layout as I am, so I'll keep this short. This slide and this slide and this slide just show that there are many different ways in which you can arrange contract text. In my world, there's always a best way of doing something, not all sorts of different ways. So I locked myself in my basement for 3 months and came up with, ta-da, the MSCD enumeration scheme. This is what's in the book. And chapter 4, I think, explains in great detail, great boring detail, exactly why this is arranged the way this is, with that as a section, this is one subsection, this is another subsection, and this is one set of tabulated enumerated clauses, this is another set. But a year and a half ago or so, I did a consulting project for one of the global car companies. And they said, thank you for our new contract, but we're not crazy, we don't like very much your enumeration scheme. Can you do something else? So I said, big client, want something different? I guess I better make them something different. So here is the second MSCD scheme. And this is, in fact, in the 4th edition of the book. So I now have 2 schemes, this one and this one. You'll notice this one is what I call first line indent. See the first line that's pushed in like that? That's first line indent. This is hanging indent. Hanging indent. This is American law firms. Yeah, that's basically it. It's U.S. big law firms. This is international commercial contracts. So I think this is already proving more popular. So I'm a little forgetting about this one, except for U.S. law firms. Everyone else, I'm giving them this. So you can find my discussion about it on the website. If you search the word layout, you will find my blog post about this, and then in the 4th edition there'll be a full discussion of it. You have sections and you have subsections. You create subsections when you have too much for one section. You say, I want to break this up a little. So here's one section, and then here's some subsections. You'll notice this is an article. If you have enough sections in a contract, you might want to divide them up into articles. But this slide is about enumerated clauses. Like, these are all enumerated clauses. Enumerated clauses are different from sections and subsections because enumerated clauses are inside one sentence. And you use enumerated clauses when you have a sentence that includes a number of separate but parallel ideas. So here, for example, you have a little introductory phrase, and then you have 3 parallel segments. It can make the segments easier to read if you enumerate them like that, but it can also make them easier to read if they're long enough if you break them up by tabulating them. So these are all enumerated clauses, but these are integrated. This is the integrated version, and this is the tabulated version. It's just a way of helping to make prose easier to read. It's it's not a matter of what I prefer, because it's a matter of how long is the text. Is the text long enough that breaking it up would make it easier to read? I think this sentence is long enough that tabulating it makes it easier to read. Bear in mind that when you tabulate, or enumerated clauses generally, this is the beginning of the sentence, this is the end of the sentence. Sometimes people put a period in the middle. That doesn't work. It's one sentence. Only you have the beginning and then a period at the end. That's it. It's not, you shouldn't have more than one sentence. In terms of what I prefer, though, it's a perfect question, because this slide shows the way Commonwealth drafters tend to do things. English, Australian, they like splitting stuff up. They like tabulating a whole lot. Basically, any sentence has more than one idea. They say, let's enumerate and tabulate. And so you have one word, and then they're tabulating. It makes contracts look a little like a shopping list. I like white space. Hey, there's white space there, there's white space there. But I think you can go a little crazy with white space and breaking everything up. It doesn't make, more white space doesn't necessarily make things easier to read. In fact, I suggest it can make things harder to read. So there's a compromise. Of course, this is what US drafters do quite often. They just cram all the text they can on the page, super long paragraphs. That's really annoying to read too. So, and this just kept on going. So that's not great either. There's a middle ground. White space is good, but not too much. Hey, not a big issue here, but who uses Times New Roman for your English language stuff? Who uses Arial? Who uses Calibri? My brother, Calibri. Now, I use, my life changed dramatically in 2007 when I started using Calibri. That's a big change in my world. There's no reason why you would know it, but people like what they're used to. So I rely on what typography specialists say. And they all say, stop using Times New Roman, stop using Arial. They're accidents of technology history. Times New Roman, for example, was developed in the 19th century to use with newspapers. That's great. Does that mean it's going to work for on-screen reading in the 21st century? Not really. So, since contracts aren't trying to persuade anyone, it's like software code, so I don't really care a whole lot. Calibri is fine for me. If you want to experiment, Constantia, you could try it. I wrote on my blog about, I can't remember which company, was it Microsoft, I think, maybe, uses something I never heard of before, Seago UI. That's available too. The basic rule is you have to use what is called a system font, one of the core fonts. If you're using a PC, because you don't want to use something fancy that turns into some mystery font on the other guy's computer. So it has to be a basic system font. But my only point is, if you're using Times New Roman and Arial, you might want to be adventurous and try something else. You might like it. Do you ever see the all caps thing? Mostly from U.S. lawyers. Do U.S. lawyers send you stuff with all caps? And you say, why the all caps? And they say, it's required by law. And you say, okay. But now you can tell them, Adam said, Adam said, you're talking nonsense. Because the Uniform Commercial Code in the U.S. says that some contract provisions have to be conspicuous. All that conspicuous means is that you can see them clearly. Lawyers, crazy lawyers say, oh, conspicuous must mean, let's say, all caps, because that's the only thing you could do on typewriters is all capitals. But no one likes reading all capitals. And U.S. court, one court I mentioned in the book says, for something to be conspicuous, you don't have to do anything necessarily. If it's, the language that the court was talking about was on page 2, and it had white space above it, white space below it. It was conspicuous, even though it didn't have any special treatment. So, if you want to make something conspicuous and you feel you want to make it look special, use bold italics or put a box around it. So that's what you can tell U.S. lawyers who give you all caps. Defined terms. All right. We've talked a little bit about defined terms. The defined term is the label you use for a longer concept. Using the label allows you to express that concept more concisely and clearly than you would otherwise. You don't want to be misleading. For example, if your definition is a little of net operating income is a little different from the usual definition of net operating income, you might want to make that clear by calling it adjusted net operating income. And your defined term is going to have to be should be as specific as it needs to be. If you're talking about one piece of land, you can call it the real property. If your deal involves 25 pieces of land, 5 of them in Acme Town, you're going to have to use a more specific label for each piece of land. But the main issue is, for the first question is, how are you going to create a defined term? You have two choices. You can use autonomous definitions or integrated definitions. Here are some autonomous definitions. They look familiar? Are you comfortable with the notion of defined terms? Is it familiar to you? I would have guessed it is. You create an autonomous definition by saying the term you're defining, then you have a definitional verb, and then you have the rest of the definition. If you have a number of them, they're in alphabetical order. Definitional verb means works for you 96% of the time. The book explains that refers to can be useful in some contexts. Don't use includes. Don't say widget includes blah, 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 because if you use an includes definition, you're in effect saying, and widget can mean other things too. Maybe we'll fight about that later. And I did a seminar at Mattel, the U.S. toy maker, when they were in the middle of a years-long litigation over who owned a particular kind of doll. And we discussed how that dispute was caused by an includes definition. Don't stuff your autonomous definitions. Don't use them as a convenient place to put stuff. So, alternative clearing system means this. Don't stick in that parenthetical language just because, it's a convenient place to put it. It complicates things. And committee means the Acme Stock Option Committee, period. How many people are on the committee and what its responsibilities are, you say later. I found that Australians are champions of stuffing definitions. The provisions are very simple. but they're all defined terms, and you look at the definitions, and the definitions go on for a page and a half. Each definition is like that. Don't include an integrated definition in an autonomous definition. We'll look at integrated definitions in a moment. But in effect, I just say the SEC. I would not define SEC in this autonomous definition. Okay, integrated definitions are where you state a concept in the text, and then right after you put a set of parentheses like this that tells the reader, hey reader, that concept you just read, we're going to use this defined term to refer to it. Have you seen both of these approaches in your contracts? All right. By the way, you put the defined term parenthetical at the end of the definition, not in the middle. The end of the definition is at the end of the sentence here. We're going to go right to here, which the basic question is, all right, you need to create a defined term. The question you have to ask is, am I going to use an integrated definition or an autonomous definition to create the defined term? One issue is, how long is the definition? The longer the definition, the more likely it is that an autonomous definition is the thing to do. But then there's also another question, which is, would it be best to place the definition in a definition section? Are you familiar with definition section? Okay. So, in terms of the choice, your choice is whether you define the term on-site or in a definition section. Defining a term on-site means you define it close to the provision that makes the most use of that defined term. You can have, integrated definitions are always on-site because it's in the provision. It's the parentheses that are in the provision. That parenthetical creating the defined term is in the provision, so that's on-site. But you can also have autonomous definitions that are on-site. You can have a section 3A that deals with some financial mechanism. Then 3B says, in this agreement, the following definitions apply, and you have 4 autonomous definitions that are used in 3A. You define them in 3B, so the reader can read 3A and then just look down to 3B and see the autonomous definitions of those defined terms. That's on-site as well. The alternative is a definition section. The disadvantages are clear enough. You're reading a section, you encounter a defined term you don't know the meaning of, so you flip to the definition section. Whether it's at the front or the back, you read the definition, it points you to another definition in the definition section. So you turn to that, you read that, and then you go back to where you started. There's a lot of flipping of pages, and it's distracting. And often, I find the most popular place to put the definition section is the beginning of the body of the contract. I don't know if that's your experience. But there's a general organizing principle that you put the most important stuff first and then the less important stuff after. The reader is not interested in reading 10 pages of definition section as the first thing. They're most interested in the deal points. So putting the definition section first doesn't really make sense. So I put it towards the back in the miscellaneous provisions part of the contract. Sure.
What do you think of the use of footnotes?
Someone mentioned that yesterday, using footnotes. You never see that. Do you see it? How often do you see it here?
An agreement?
Okay, all right. Well, since it was the second day, I thought, so someone asked that, I thought, is that the way they do things here? No, no. I mean, one could do it, but basically, back to the teaching old dogs new tricks sort of thing. That's a new trick I'm not going to try and teach. These two, I'm okay with the alternatives we have. Now, the advantage of a definition section is that if you were to define everything on site, the provisions could get a little cluttered. So here is my compromise. If the meaning of a defined term is entirely or largely clear, put it in the definition section. By entirely clear, I'm referring to defined terms for government agencies, defined terms for statutes, a defined term like GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, basically defined terms that anyone who reads your contracts should know the meaning of. And in terms of, defined terms that are largely clear, I'm thinking of defined terms like person or affiliate or business day. If you encounter business day in a contract you're reading, you're not going to stop and say, I have no idea what business day means. You're going to say, I know what business day means. It's a day that's not a holiday. But there are different ways you can define it. But I don't need to stop what I'm doing when I'm reading a provision and I counter business day. I don't have to stop and say, I must know what this means to understand this provision. You say, yeah, I know what business day means, and I'll look at the definition later to see exactly how it's defined. So define terms with a meaning that is entirely or largely clear. That's stuff that is obvious. And you don't need to put in the reader's face the obvious stuff. So in the definition section it goes, and I'm going to put it towards the back in the miscellaneous provisions part of the contract. Then you have defined terms that don't have an obvious meaning, defined terms that are custom built for the transaction, for this contract. A defined term like excluded liabilities. If I see excluded liabilities in provision, I'm going to say, I need to know what that means to understand this. So with a defined term like that, I'm going to put the meaning on site so the reader has access to it. So they don't have to run around looking for it. The result is that in longer contracts, I can have a definition section at the back, and then I might have what are in effect mini definition sections on site, where for a particular section I say, here are some defined terms that the reader is going to need to know the meaning of to read this section. And it so happens that it makes sense for me to define them as autonomous definitions. So I put this little groups of autonomous definitions on site. Sometimes people see that and say, oh, isn't it neater to put everything in the definition section? I say, that's simpler. It's like, all right, everything in the definition section, but that doesn't make the reader's life easier, because they're just going to have to keep flipping to the definition section that is just annoying and distracting. So that's my approach. Are you with me so far? Another factor that goes with that is cross-references. Drafters can think, okay, I'm using this defined term, I'm using it before I've defined it, so the reader is going to panic if they see the defined term. I have to tell them where it's defined. So what do? They put a cross-reference parenthetical, like this. In fact, they like the idea so much that they put it after every time you use change and control. That's kind of crazy. That's I've only seen this sort of thing once. So you might say, okay, that's silly. We'll just do it once. After the first time we use the defined term, we'll have a cross-reference like this. But people don't read contracts like they're reading a story. Let's start at the top and work our way down. Instead, they jump around. So a single cross-reference parenthetical is, to use an English expression, it's a bit of a needle in a haystack. It's, I'll be interested to hear what the interpreter offers as a metaphor. Did the interpreter offer a different metaphor? As, perhaps finding something in the desert. I don't know. But it is, it's not going to be necessarily easy for the reader to find that single cross-reference parenthetical, so I don't do that. Here's another way readers try and address the issue of, where is the definition for this defined term? In the definition section. Here we have a part of a definition section with autonomous definitions, and then in alphabetical order you have these cross-references. I don't do this either, because these are kind of wordy. They're wordy, and also since they're in alphabetical order, if you want to consult cross-references, you're going to be flipping pages through the definition section. So I don't do that. So I can hear you all saying, well, what do you do then? Ta-da! The index of definitions. I don't know whether you deal with contracts that are long enough to use this, but essentially an index of definitions lists every defined term. These are all the defined terms, even those that are in the definition section. The pages in the 30s are the definition section. And they have the page number, which is more useful than the section number. And this is automated using Word's indexing feature, so you can update it automatically. And by the way, as a matter of survival and not using up your brain cells, I recommend that you learn how to do things like create a table of contents, create an index, and particularly use automatic cross-references, because updating cross-references manually is a terrible thing to have to do regularly. My rule for index of definitions is, if your contract has a table of contents, then maybe you want to put an index of definitions after the table of contents. No table of contents, well, obviously the contract isn't so long that you feel the reader needs help as to structure of the contract. If that's the case, they probably don't need help finding where terms have been defined, particularly if, as I suggest, you put the important ones on site, so they're not going to be running around looking for where terms have been defined. Any questions so far? Is this okay? Does it make any sense? Is it useful? Is it relevant at all?
Sometimes they include in the attachment at the end of the contract a schedule for acronyms.
Acronyms. I wouldn't. It seems silly to treat acronyms and initialisms, two versions of the same thing. Like SEC is an initialism, NASA is an acronym. But anyway, it seems you're saying, it seems silly to treat them separately from other defined terms. And you said they're so obvious.
It's like FDA.
I know. But I'm okay with doing, and the book says, hey, do the obvious. Because I don't want to be in the business of judging what initialisms and anachronisms are, and initialisms and acronyms are obvious, because
They cannot be combined together, definitions and.
Oh, sure, yes, that's what I do. I just put them all in the definitions. Well, the question is, okay, let's see. FDA is, that's obvious. So, okay, we'll define it in the definition section. But I wouldn't make a separate list of initialisms. I just put it in the definition section. And in terms of whether something is obvious, okay, FDA, if you're in a drug development industry, then sure, we know what FDA means. But I wouldn't make any assumptions regarding who is going to read your contract, because contracts can have a broad readership. Don't assume anyone who's going to read this is going to know what FDA means. That might not be the case. So just define FDA too. Define even the obvious stuff. And I wouldn't put, I'm not a fan of putting a definition section in a schedule, because that just makes it even harder to look at. Just put it towards the end of the contract, but in the body of the contract. If you're going to create a defined term, you might as well use it in a way that makes sense. The defined term is change in control. It's defined to mean, the definition is a change in control of the company, blah, 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 blah. So of the company is built into the definition. Nevertheless, the drafter used the defined term, but then put of the company after. It's redundant because of the company is built into the defined term. But you see this sort of thing quite a lot anyway. So, when I feel the urge to create a defined term, I ask myself these questions. Do I need to create a defined term? Defined terms allow you to state a concept more concisely and consistently than you would otherwise, but defined terms come at a cost. When you use an autonomous definition, you're telling the reader, read this, reader, and then read this separate autonomous definition. So you're breaking up the reading. And an integrated definition, the parenthetical, creates a bit of clutter in a contract. And then all those initial capitals make a contract harder to read. So you have to decide whether the value of a defined term exceeds the cost. And in the US, the tendency is to say, hey, it's a contract, let's use lots of defined terms. And you'll see things like one sentence that refers to a concept like option notice. So the drafter creates the defined term option notice in the first sentence and uses the defined term in the second sentence, and then you never see it again. That's not economical use of a defined term. I wouldn't create the defined term, and in the second sentence, I would just say, that option notice. They're easy, standard English ways. You can say, hey, that thing we mentioned the previous sentence, without having to create a defined term. So when I redraft a company's contracts, I can generally expect to get rid of a quarter to a third of the defined terms. A week ago, I worked on a contract for one of the national U.S. banks. A page and a half of definition section at the front. I got rid of it all, and then just said I'll define terms as I need them. And I probably had, instead of 32 defined terms, I ended up with 5 or something. So sometimes you can gain real economies by just taking a closer look at all the defined terms. What defined term should you use? You don't want it to be misleading. You want it to be just specific enough for your needs. Would the reader need to consult the definition to understand the defined term? In other words, is the meaning entirely or largely clear? Into the definition section. If it's custom made for the transaction, you put it on site. And if it's on site, do you use integrated or autonomous definition? That depends in part on how long the definition is, or just what the circumstances suggest, what the circumstances permit. That is Define terms. Any questions? Was this useful discussion? Okay. Ambiguity. All right. There's a chapter in the book called Sources of Uncertainty. In the new edition, it's called Sources of Uncertain Meaning. And a few months ago, I adjusted it after help from my linguist friends. But here's the basic idea. There are different kinds of confusion in contracts. If you want to know how to fix the confusion, you have to be able to identify the kinds of confusion. I wrote this chapter because I've heard lawyers and judges saying it's ambiguous as a way of saying it's confusing. But in fact, ambiguity is just one kind of confusion. It's not just, it's just confusing generally. So if you want to understand confusion, you have to understand the sources. There are different sources. One of them, a big one, is ambiguity. That's where something has two inconsistent meanings. You give a provision to a group of readers, some think it means X, others think it means Y. That provision is ambiguous. Then you have these other kinds of confusion, for example, where you have two conflicting provisions. You can't have both of them working in the contract. Or you just don't address an issue. But the other big source of confusion is vagueness. Vagueness isn't a matter of alternative meanings, it's a matter of uncertain boundaries. A word like promptly is vague. You might do something so fast that there's no question that, hey, everyone will say, you did that promptly. But the more time you take, the greater the chance that at some point someone's going to say, hey, you didn't do that promptly. And because doing something promptly is a matter of what a reasonable person would do in the circumstances, different people can have different ideas of what promptly means. So vagueness involves the possibility of dispute. You can get into a fight over vagueness. So you might say, you might think, hey, you said not getting into fights is just a basic idea of contract drafting. Yes, but there are going to be some contexts where it doesn't make sense to be precise, and being vague is going to be your best option. For example, if you have a provision with a limit on legal expenses, but the future holds the possibility of someone suing you because they slip on a banana peel, or you're being involved in some massive environmental contamination litigation, those are very different circumstances. So having a specific amount of money as the limit on legal expenses, no more than $10,000, isn't going to make sense in all those contexts. So you might say, well, this contract is going to address a broad range of possibilities. A specific dollar amount isn't going to work, or a specific amount of whatever currency. So the best thing we can say is reasonable legal expenses. That's a vague standard. You can get into a fight over reasonable, but in this context, it's probably the most sensible thing you can do. So vagueness is an essential tool of the drafter to be used carefully when being precise doesn't make sense.
How about generalization?
Sorry?
Generalization.
Okay. If you want to consider that, you can't generalize. You can't be you have to give me really specific examples.
The contractor has to perform according to the best standards.
Well, you know what? I believe we're going to talk about that sort of thing really soon. So stay tuned in half an hour or so. All right. We'll now look at some kinds of ambiguity. One kind is called lexical, where a word just has alternative possible meanings. The book talks about a fight over what computer means. A video game company had a contract with the developer. Developer agreed not to develop computer games for competitors.